So in November of 2013, I did an interview with Travel and Leisure magazine over about the city where I live, Portland, Oregon. It was for a piece called America's Best Cities for Hipsters, something that we're kind of known for. And if you're not familiar with the term hipster, it generally refers to somebody who kind of likes to rock a beard, really thick glasses, enjoys artisan foods, microbrews. Hipsters like to be seen as progressive, as independent thinkers, and as unique. In other words, like a lot of other kinds of labels, a hipster is defined by actions and by attitude. But because the term has received such negative connotations over the last few years, most people kind of shy away from it. You don't find people readily self-proclaiming themselves as being a hipster. But that's kind of natural, isn't it? We tend to avoid conversations or labels that we're not comfortable with in our society. And our society in particular has demonized the R word so much so that people avoid having actual meaningful conversations about it. We like to pretend that this issue doesn't exist in our schools, our places of worship, in our offices, our banking institutions, and by the police. Well, that word and that problem, of course, is racism. A recent survey discovered that only 6% of whites believe that racism is a very serious problem. In a similar study by Gallup, they discovered that 7 out of 10 whites believe that Black Americans are treated exactly the same in our society. 8 out of 10 believe that Blacks have the same opportunities when it comes to education. And 83% believe that Black Americans have the same opportunities when it comes to housing as white Americans. Only 1 out of 3 whites believe that Blacks are treated any differently by the police than white Americans, which means 2 out of 3 whites in our country believe that Blacks are treated exactly the same by the police. But when you look at the data, it's appallingly clear that this isn't the case at all. A major national study revealed that those with white-sounding names are actually 50% more likely to get a call back for a job interview than someone with a Black-sounding name. First-time arrests for Black youth are 48 times higher to be incarcerated than that of white youth, even when all factors of the crime are identical. In fact, it's so bad that the average Black male has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in his lifetime. Now, in fact, in the face of these staggering statistics, either you have to believe that people of color are naturally criminally inclined, that we're somehow genetically wired to perform poorly in school, that we are predisposed to having bad credit, or you believe that there's a systemic-wide issue in our health, education, financial, government sectors. Either way, it confirms the existence of some kind of form of racism in our society. Now, I like to believe the best in people, and I don't think that most people are intentionally racist. We've actually done a couple of really great things in the last few years or decades in making progress against it. But by pretending that it's not a relevant problem anymore, and by not having these meaningful discussions, we actually perpetuate its existence, and we can often make things worse. So let me give you a couple examples of how this could kind of play out. Last month, I met a woman who told me that she wasn't attracted to Asians. No worries, I said. I'm not attracted to racists. She was a little shocked. And she said, well, hey, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist, but I just don't date Asians. Now, what I think is interesting is that some people would agree that her statement wasn't actually racist, even though what she was really doing was presenting over 100 different ethnicities and cultures as if it were monolithic, as if somehow billions of people on this planet share some kind of superficial quality that would make it impossible for her to form an emotional connection. And that's called prejudice. Prejudice based on race, which, let's face it, that's the definition of racism. She thought it was a perfectly natural thing to feel. What she was probably doing, because she wasn't being intentionally racist about it, but what she was probably doing was embedding and internalizing that bias that the society and that entertainment and then the media presents about race, culture, and sexuality. Just last week in the news, I don't know if you heard this, but there was a report of the police who assaulted a black teenager in his own home. You see, he lived in a predominantly white neighborhood, and when he was entering the house, a neighbor called thinking that he was a burglar. The police came in through the door, and they asked him, "What are you doing in here?" And he says, "I live here. What are you doing here?" The officer points at the picture of two white children on the mantelpiece as to imply that this teenager was lying. And rather than questioning him further or calling his parents, they pepper sprayed him in the eyes so that he had to receive emergency medical treatment. You see, this officer would rather believe the stereotype of a black troubled youth than to believe that it's possible for a black teenager to live with a white family. I myself have been fighting a case of kind of racial misunderstanding with the government. You see, for the past 5 years, I've been fighting against the United States Patent and Trademark Office over the right to register our band's name. They believe that our name, the Slants, is an inherent racial slur against Asian Americans. They came to this conclusion because our band is actually comprised of Asian Americans. And bear with me for a moment. Their logic kind of goes like this. They believe that if people see us and they see our name, that people automatically think of the racial slur, the antiquated racial slur from the 1930s, than any other definition in the dictionary. Essentially, if I were white or any other race, this wouldn't be an issue. So in the name of fighting against racism, they are denying me a right based on my race. You know, they're not being intentionally racist, but they're certainly embodying all those characteristics of racism. What I think is even more interesting is that in the past 5 years, they've not actually talked with the issue with a single Asian American. No Asian American leaders or organizations, no experts on racial relations, because in their minds, these white attorneys believe that they understood what racial discrimination looked like to Asian Americans. And when a governor-appointed board of Asian American leaders from Oregon wrote them a letter saying, "Why aren't you talking to Asians about this issue? Because that's what the law says you're required to do," they simply wrote back saying, "We're very committed to diversity, and there are many Asian Americans that work in our office and in Washington, D.C." Now, despite what some people might think, racial awareness and understanding does not come through osmosis. You know, simply having a person of color in the building or in the community doesn't mean you understand the racial experiences that they have to go through, right? But it was something that they thought. And they thought, well, our intention's not being racist. You know, our law is equal, even though the application of it is vastly different. And it turns out that the law they're using has been disproportionately affecting minorities for about 70 years now. But that's not uncommon. Florida's state constitution still has a law embedded in it that prevents Asians from owning property. When a measure was on the ballot to remove this law, Floridians voted to keep it. And this happens all the time. Unaware voters uphold laws that are designed to discriminate based on race, or that fail to take into account the historical biases and built over the last 2 centuries that has created such an unequal playing field. Now, I think part of the problem is that we have different perspectives in how we approach these things. You know, we talk to a white person about racism, the conversation usually goes like this. Things are so much better than they used to be. We've made a lot of progress. I mean, we got rid of slavery, we got the Civil Rights Act, we have a black president in office. Things are so much better. In other words, it's a look to the past of what their lives were like for grandparents and their great-grandparents and what society was like then. When you talk to a person of color, we tend to say things like, things could be a little bit better. The average net worth of a white family is 20 times higher than that of a black family and 18 times higher than that of a Latino family. Racism is so bad that light-skinned immigrants get 17% higher pay than dark-skinned immigrants for the exact same job. Think about what our world would look like without racism. Think about what our world would look like in the future for our children and our grandchildren. It's a look to the future. Even just this morning, I woke up in our hotel. The front page of USA Today is a story about how in the tech industry, minorities are not hired, how black and Latino youth are college graduates coming from the same top prestigious schools as white candidates aren't even being interviewed by tech companies. Racism is not a thing of the past. It's an everyday reality that we have to live with, sadly. But pretending it doesn't exist, ignoring the news, and thinking that it isn't relevant to our communities only continues to make things worse. Because like any other disease, we need to deal with awareness, the root causes, as well as treatment. Now, oftentimes I get accused of playing the race card. There's this mythical idea out there that somehow people of color are incapable of an objective assertion of the facts, that we're incapable of reasoning, that we have to rely on some kind of Trump move to get sympathy. But even if this mythical race card were real, what kind of progress has it actually made? Why is it that people never call out the card of denial? Like when people say race isn't a factor in issues like Ferguson, or what happened with Trayvon Martin, or when you look at all the inequalities throughout our country. Why is it that you never hear of the race card being played when whites claim there's an issue of reverse racism? Why is it that the media only reports on black crime when white on white crime is actually 4 to 6 times higher across our country? It's staggering, the differences on how this is presented, isn't it? A lot of times I'll hear things like, well, we've elected a black president, as if that one event was a magic eraser to wipe away centuries of oppression. That would be like saying, in 1932, we elected a president with a physical disability, so we should stop building accessibility ramps and having handicap spaces because that's reverse discrimination against the able-bodied. And women have been elected as heads of state and appointed as heads of state in countries like China, India, and Pakistan, yet somehow you don't see people clamoring to claim the end of sexism in those countries. We need to stop treating this epidemic and start treating the experience of millions of people like it's a relic of the past, like it's smallpox or polio. It is a current everyday reality. We need to give racism a chance to exist in everyday conversations, even when it's uncomfortable, so that we can build a more equitable future and make things a lot better. I believe we need to stop thinking that racism is just a matter of burning crosses and white hoods. You see, racism doesn't have to fit your stereotype of what racism is in order for it to discriminate or to hurt communities. By voting for laws and not being an aware voter, by ignoring it, by refusing to talk about it in a meaningful manner, you're upholding racism as a system that we have to live in. That's a form of racism, whether it is intentional or conscious or not. So I'd like to challenge you today to begin by having an uncomfortable conversation about race. Begin to talk about it in a meaningful manner and how it affects our communities. Only then can we make that better future for our children and build a more equitable society. Let's make progress and justice a process and not an afterthought. Let's make the news like this a thing of the past. Begin by giving racism a chance. Thank you.